Well, Eric, super excited to have you on the show today. This is probably episode 3 or 4 of different Dadpreneurs. Eric, you are the CEO of Freshline Moto Club.
I don't know. Well, I don't know if I get that fancy with a title. My title's president. I try not to put anything out there that's not that's gonna get my ego ahead of myself because that'll get you in trouble in this type of business for sure.
Yeah. And you organize motorcycle expeditions for very, very adventurous guys. Um, and I'm super excited to dive into like what that actually looks like, how the business got started. But I wanted to start with a quote because it comes from a book about expeditions that I'm currently reading. Have you ever heard of A Scottish Himalayan Expedition, the book?
A Scottish Himalayan expedition. No.
It's by an author called W.H. Murray. They do this crazy expedition in the 1950s. And this quote actually I've seen in multiple books. So I'll just read it out. It's a little bit long, but I think it
Okay.
kind of tees us up nicely. Until one is committed, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents, meetings, and material assistance. And this is what he like opens his book about in the 1950s, right before he's launching this like 6-month massive expedition to go to the Himalayas and do peaks that have never been touched.
Mhm.
So I'd be curious to like what lands for you because you're in the space of expeditions and how that quote hits.
We have four values at Freshline, and one of them is persist with purpose. And so that value ties into what was written there. And within that quote, every single one, or sorry, within our value at least, we always have a definition tied to that. And the definition pretty clearly states like, set a goal for yourself and then put an action plan towards it. And yeah, you might have to reroute, but you keep moving forward. As far as like my path with Freshline, it's really interesting because I wouldn't be surprised if there's a number of listeners that are tuning into this podcast that, because they're an entrepreneur, have some level of ADHD, potentially, which is true of myself. And when I was in my 20s, I had the luxury of like having an idea and jumping into a business, and had also had the luxury to a degree of running multiple businesses at the same time. And I thought is the wrong term. I communicated to the outside world I had multiple businesses because I thought that made me look smart. In reality, the reason I had multiple businesses was because none of them was making the financial gains that I wanted it to. And so I was always chasing the next thing. Freshline is a little bit of a different endeavor in the sense that Freshline was one of my side businesses. It was like a thing on the side. Ironically, it was the side business that was never actually intended to be a business. I was chasing all these other things that was like, okay, this is the thing that's going to make me the money. And this is the thing that's going to make me the money. And Freshline was like, I'd literally told myself like, this is a super fun project. And maybe I'll turn this into my main thing when I retire. Like I'll go make my money somewhere else and do that. There was a catalyst that occurred for me, which was we had a member that came on an expedition that called me up a year after the expedition that he was on. And he asked if we'd be willing to take on an investor. And it turned out this guy was fairly independently wealthy. And he had a life-changing experience with one of our expeditions with Freshline. It was like, I want to go have that kind of impact on people in the world. Like I can see what you guys are doing, but we were super small scale. He's like, would you consider like taking this on and ramping it up? And so we ended up taking that offer and ramping Freshline up coming out of 21, more so going into 22. But the full story is like, I had a business that was doing marketing consulting, specifically within the tourism sector. And as we all know, in 2022, tourism sector was not a great business to be in, especially tourism marketing. And so that business took a pretty substantial hit. And I was looking for I shouldn't say I was looking for. Initially, I ran that business for 8 months through COVID. Eventually, I had to lay off my employees, say, hey, I got to do something else. I took on a bunch of private clients in a variety of industries, just marketing consulting. And that's what I was doing, but I knew that's probably not what I wanted to do forever. So I was doing that. We were stable, but I was like, okay, what's the next thing for me? I'd kind of considered Freshline, but Freshline was a tourism-based business. So I was like, okay, there's not much going on there. And then we had one of our mutual colleagues, Igor, he reached out to me from Breakthrough Academy, and they were running a consulting business for trades entrepreneurs. In this case, not marketing consulting, but they were doing more management consulting, management operations consulting. Really, really well thought out framework that they had. Excellent team of employees. And Igor was having trouble with the person that they had hired as their marketing director. And by happenstance, about a year before, as a friend, I'd sent him like a 3-page, here's my thoughts on your guys' marketing plan. And here's where I think you guys might be able to improve. Here's where I see opportunity that you guys aren't tapping into. And so I didn't know it at the time, but like, yeah, maybe a year and a half later, Igor came to me and was like, hey, you remember you sent me that thing? That, like, the more I read that document you sent me, it seems to be so much more on the money in terms of strategy and what we should be doing than what this current marketing director was pulling for. So he asked if I'd be willing to come on and build out essentially their entire content department in the marketing, and then also with that aid in the building out of something that they hadn't really done much before, which was building out an engine that drove to webinars. And that was also wasn't super clear because everyone in the industry up till that point said, oh, these are trades guys. Trades guys will never get onto a webinar. So it hadn't really been done at scale. And so that was the challenge, was going into that business and doing that. I'm getting carried away with this story, by the way, but Freshline was kind of like on the side, not much happening. But then I took this position with these guys at BTA, and I had told them from the very beginning, like, hey, I do have this Freshline thing. It might draw some of my attention while I'm with you guys. Are you okay with that? And they're like, yeah, that's fine. As long as you're not like working on it during working hours. So, which was not my intention anyway. So during the day, I'd work for Breakthrough Academy, helping build out the marketing team and their content engine and the webinars and the brand. My technical title was brand manager, was basically building out that initial marketing team. A lot of that was the podcast that we were building with Benji, again, another mutual acquaintance. And as I did all during the day, and then what would happen is, because I had this investor that had approached me, I would pick up my kids, or at the time, I guess, kid, from daycare, do dinner time, and then around 8 o'clock, after I'd finished dinner, finish cleaning up the kitchen. Usually my wife cooks and I clean, so clean up the kitchen, and then from like 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock every night, I would get on sales calls for Freshline and sell. And I did that for about 2 years, and no pay. There was no pay that I had coming in from that, but I didn't need it because I had revenue coming in from this other company. What I wanted to do was build up a really solid foundation for Freshline to be able eventually to transition into it as a business model, and just see if it was viable. Like, we had taken a club that was 30 something members, and those were all just referrals. And so it was tiny. There was nothing going on. And we had to ask ourselves, could we sell this at scale? And we knew if we were going to scale, the expeditions that we ran were extremely challenging. And so we knew we needed some kind of way to filter the guys that were coming into expeditions more than just an assessment, because we tried that model, an online assessment.
Which was one of my questions, which was, how many guys apply? How many guys even make it through that initial screening? And then how many actually pass the boot camp? And for context too, we should probably set the scene too of like, what does an expedition actually look like? Like, how intense is this? What is a typical one look like?
I'll get into that, Fife. I'm really skirting around, or I'm really taking a long time to answer your initial question, which was like, what does that quote mean to you? But to try and let's try and get to the point. The point is that my wife very wisely came to me as I was building Freshline, and about a year into it, I was like, hey, this thing's actually going pretty well. Like, we're proving a model that no one else in the industry has ever proven in terms of what we were building and what we were doing. I think I could jump into this. And she had said, you have a history of jumping into things pretty quickly. Like, whatever draws your attention, you jump into it. can you prove to me that there's 2 years of really solid revenue here before you make a transition? So technically it was almost 3 years of running Freshline in the evenings. I'd literally built up a team of employees. We had 5 employees by the time I actually came onto payroll within Freshline and started full time, which was really only the beginning of this year. So it's September right now. And so this was in January that I made that jump into Freshline. All to say that if anyone's listening to this and if they have a hint of ADD, like I do, if you're untied, like if you're untethered and you don't have a family, do a lot of things, take a lot of risks, all of that. One thing I learned from Igor, the director of Breakthrough Academy, was just the power of consistency, and then me being married and having kids and just like really raising the bar as far as responsibility goes. I was like, no, I don't have the luxury of saying I got nothing to lose anymore. I do have something to lose. Now there's mouths to feed and family at stake. And so I'm saying that to say it's possible if you are dedicated to the thing that you're doing. So to your point on the quote, like that sureness of purpose, I was like, I know I want to do this. Like as soon as I proved that model, I was like, this is like, I could see myself doing this for the rest of my life. And it's a lot of work, and yet it doesn't feel like work because I'm so driven by the purpose there.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, if you can figure that out for yourself, which you probably, if you're anything like me, it might take a number of iterations, a lot of different businesses, different ideas, different figuring out what you're capable of and learning along the way to get there. But if you can figure that out, like it's possible where I had a kid and then a couple of young kids, like under 2. I had a full-time job and I was still building this business, built a, before I transitioned, it was already, hopefully this doesn't sound like a bragging point, but I built a $2.5 million business in the evenings off kind of the side of my desk before I decided like, okay, I'm going to jump into this and make it a real thing. So sureness of purpose is an absolute thing, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily always mean you need to burn the boats. If you've got something going on, like also be sure that you're like, hey, there's stability in what I've built. Now I can transition here. So that can sometimes go against that burning of boats mentality that you see from other people.
Yeah. And I think it really touches on something that is different for a dad who's an entrepreneur, a small business owner. It's like, you can't just burn the boats. Like there is a level of risk tolerance that changes when you have kids and a family versus the guy who's 23 can live wherever on a couch and test a bunch of things. It's just a very different level of constraints that you have.
We can transition if you're drawing, like we can transition to the Freshline model if you want to.
Yeah, I'd love to hear. Well, let's just set the stage of what is an expedition, to just wrapping our heads around what is it? Because I think there's more that meets the eye in terms of what you guys are actually offering from the outside, based on what I know.
Yeah. So I read in the book Scaling Up, I read that really good businesses, they'll have a front end marketing model, but they'll always have a special sauce on the back end of the business. So the front end, there's something special there, and you can see this business is different and they're doing things differently. But you need something on the back end as well that your competitors don't see or don't know about in order for that business to have a real X factor. And so with Freshline, we run these international global expeditions to remote reaches of the globe. And we're the only organization that does this consistently. There's definitely, there's tons of solo operators out there who will go and explore the globe on their own. There's also a number of tour agencies out there who will organize tours to remote locations. You can find a tour agency in the States that'll organize tours to Panama or to Kazakhstan or to wherever. The difference with us is that we say we don't organize tours, we organize expeditions. And there's so many elements that are in that are quite different than a tour company. So one, every single one of our expeditions that we run, we go to a new destination. We have a rule that we never go back to the same place twice. So everyone that's on the expedition team is there and they're exploring. Two, the expedition leaders are volunteer leaders within the club, within the organization. They're not paid tour guides. They also have never been to that destination they're going to. What they will have done is they will have organized the logistics for that expedition and planned everything out starting 14 months out is when our planning begins for any expedition. So they'll spend that 14 months going through all the details and planning that expedition, but they've never been there. So when you get on the ground, what happens is things change all the time because no one's familiar with the terrain that they're in. But our philosophy is we go in super prepared so that when plans do change, we're able to flex with them. And that's everything from the leader going into prepared to the expedition team going in prepared. So there's a difference right there. Another difference between us and tours is that all of our expeditions have a mission. So the mission is usually humanitarian based. We're usually going in with the intent of saying, this kind of evolved from we were going to these super remote locations. And because we were going to these super remote locations, it was pretty common where we were the first like Westerners that a lot of these people had ever seen in some of these regions. And if that's the case, often we could pretty obviously see just by going there or observe that, hey, these people, they could use medications, or they could use water, or water filtration, or they could use school supplies, or they could use access to a computer or something. So we began developing our expeditions as missions. So every single expedition has a mission, again, different than a tour company. And then another massive factor is that our expedition teams, the guys that are on that expedition team, they're all very thoroughly vetted through this boot camp that we have. So all of these things that we've kind of applied have been learned through mishaps and failures and stuff over time. But what we found in the early days is we knew that the expeditions we ran were going to be a little bit challenging. And so we used to do just a video application. You'd sit down with us for an hour and do a video application. We still have that just to vet guys going into the boot camp. So you still have to sit down with us for 45 minutes before you're even eligible to go to the boot camp. Then if we're like, yeah, I think you're good to go, we'll send you to the boot camp in Africa. Oh, the boot camp doesn't take place here in North America. It's a boot camp in Africa. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Throwing them into completely different environment than most guys are used to see how they actually interact with that environment versus one they're familiar to. And then, sorry, I just got a notification on my computer got closed down. And then once those guys are vetted in that boot camp, then they'll go as a prospect on an expedition team. And they're actually not a full-fledged member until they've run their first expedition. And then we have expeditions that are members only, that are like the most extreme expeditions that we've got. So in a number of different ways, we differ from most other organizations that run any kind of tour. That's on the front end. That's what everybody sees on the front end. What people don't see is the back end, which is the secret sauce to this, is that the core of this business is not at all selling motorcycle expeditions. The core of this business is built around forming a strong brotherhood, a strong community of guys who are there to support each other outside of the expeditions. We always say, hey, expeditions, for most guys, they're going on an expedition once a year. We're like, that's 2 weeks out of the year. There's another 50 weeks. Like, what are we doing with that time? And so we have a very kind of robust member portal on the back end that has a whole bunch of different kind of chat forum like areas and places where guys can ask questions. Guys, like there's a whole section on just member value adds. So there's a section in there where members can go and just say, hey, I've got this skill, or a lot of it is guys just offering up their place. Hey, I've got this place that's in Colorado, or I've got this place that's in Brisbane, or I've got this place that's here in Iceland. Like, guys, anybody can come and hang out with me as long as they're a vetted Freshline member. And then we get on member huddles every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks we'll go on a member huddle. We'll have we're always going to have a breakout period where we have a discussion topic for that breakout period, and that goes relatively deep. That also has evolved out of both our boot camps and our expeditions. Every night that we run a boot camp or an expedition, we have campfire chat topics. And so unlike, I think, a lot of other men's tour groups that go out, at least what we hear from the motor rental agencies that we worked with, they're like, you guys are so different from any group we've ever rented to, because most of the time you get a bunch of guys together and kind of their MO is to ride as hard as they can and then party as hard as they can at night, because now they've got that time off. We ride hard, but then at the evenings, don't get me wrong, we'll have a few beer, but the evenings is actually dedicated to like deeper conversations, getting to know each other and the locals that we're spending that time with. And so we get way more involved in the communities that we're getting into than the average group. So we hear. So, and that ties into another one of our values, which is leave it better. One of our strong values is everywhere we go, every interaction we have, we ask ourselves, how do we leave this thing better? And that includes ourselves, like getting to know ourselves, getting to know the people around us, getting to know the other members on the team even better, getting to know the locals that we're visiting, getting to know the environment that we're in. How do we leave all of those things better? And so that's what a lot of those missions developed out of, was this like leave it better concept. So yeah, across the board, it's like this weird mishmash of like, is it a tour company? Is it a men's group? And that's the other thing. It's men only. It's a men's only organization. We formed a sister chapter called We Roam. That's for women only, because we don't have anything against women. But for us, because the conversational brotherhood piece was so important, we found out through having women on boot camps and expeditions very rapidly that one woman in the group completely shifts the dynamic with the guys. The focus has shifted. The things that they're willing to divulge at campfire shifted. Like everything changes. And so we said, hey, nothing against women, but we're going to try and protect this one space for guys and make it that. So yeah.
What you talk a lot about like this campfire aspect, going deeper with guys. What have you learned about being a dad and a business owner through some of those conversations? Like, have there been any like particular lessons that really stand out to you that you've picked up on through those interactions?
Maybe the best way of expressing this, like we've gotten quite a bit out of the campfire topics. I was thinking I can go a couple different avenues with this. One is like Jordan and myself, the two guys that, so Jordan's the other co-founder of the business, the guys that started it. We hold our own, just the two of us, campfire chat every week within the business. We have 1 hour block that we sit down, and it's strictly, let's not talk about business. We're just going into like what's really going on in our personal lives. And throughout the years, because we've done this for years, we've held each other extremely accountable, and we know each other really well. So we know each other's blind spots, we know each other's faults, we know each other's strengths, and that helps us build each other up when we're down, and that also helps us take each other down a notch when our ego's getting ahead of ourselves, which has happened to both of us. Absolutely. I think there's been a few things for me that have definitely shifted like my perspective as a dad. One was I gotten feedback from guys in the club that I need to be very aware of being overly confident in my decision making if I don't really know the answer or don't fully know what I'm talking about. So definitely some humility there. On the flip side of that, something that's really helped is like, if I've got something I'm struggling with either the business, there's a few things in the business for sure, because probably almost 80% of our guys are business owners. Well, they're all men, so our business owners, a lot of them are dads. So a lot of these guys have been ahead of me. In fact, Jordan and I are on the young end of the spectrum in terms of the guys that we attract. Most of our guys, I say the average age is around 45, and I'm a decade younger than that. So learning from guys that are a few steps ahead of me has been really valuable. But then also just, if I share with the guys at these campfire chats, like, hey, here's something I'm really struggling with this in my marriage, or like something that can, in a sense where you don't know the guys, can appear to be weak or damaging to your reputation, saying, hey guys, like this is something that like I don't like to admit, but like here's a problem I have. When you're sitting around a campfire with like 10 other guys and they start saying, oh yeah, me too. You're like, oh, thank God. Like, it's not just me. It doesn't mean the problem goes away, but you're like, oh, okay, this is not a me thing. This is a guy thing. And that's helped a lot as well. Just give context to my situation and where I'm at. And you're like, yeah, okay, sure, I'm struggling with things, but this is not completely abnormal either. And so other guys have gone through it. And then a lot of those guys will say, or they'll give advice. What we try and do in those campfires is not give advice directly, but say, okay, instead of just telling guys what to do, ask questions that will lead the guy to that answer for themselves. And so a lot of guys have asked some pretty probing questions like, well, have you done this, or have you tried that, or have you thought about this? And you're like, oh shit, no. So I'm speaking in kind of like vague terms, but if I was to like summarize what's the value in the club to me, in terms of how it's impacted my life, this goes back to another one of the values that we set, but this wasn't the value always in the club, but it was something that came from the club, was this accountability that we have as guys for each other turned into a value that we say is own your shit. So it's just like, hey, your life is your life because you made it that way for the most part. And I can see for me, I wouldn't say it's dramatic changes, but man, like I feel like I'm feeling the fruit of years of living that out, of like having that concept shift fully into like your life is your life because of you, like because of the decisions you made. And having that reflective element of like, okay, shit, if this was on me, what could have I done differently? How could I have prepared better? How could I have like done a better job doing research, thought this out, whatever? And like, it's almost like therapy is like every day you're kind of getting a little bit better at that act. And over time, it gives you a life that builds a so much more control for yourself, because you're like, oh, like I have the ability to control my outcomes. Not always, but for the most part, if you're assuming that attitude of ownership. And so I'd say that's probably been the biggest factor that's impacted my life if I look at it overall.
Yeah. I think like the word that popped up into my head is like radical responsibility. It's that level of ownership you take over everything. And I think it's one thing to conceptually understand it. Like you could read that in a book. You could like be like, okay, I'm going to do that. Like it's something else when you actually embody it and live it and have to like go through those experiences where you're not, and like iteratively get better. But it does, I think it shifts something deep down and you just approach life different. I was talking to another coach recently and we were challenging a group because we're doing some leadership development with them. It's like, what if everything you're complaining about is actually on you?
Yeah.
And it's just like, people don't want to hear that. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but man, does it change how you interact with the world when you do.
It's a bitter pill to swallow. And at the same time, I think it's like, man, it
can be freeing.
So freeing when you figure that out, because dude, like I deal with issues every day. I'm like, oh, this is a problem. I'm like, why is it my fault that this is happening? And pretty quickly it comes into like, well, it's because I didn't communicate this, or I didn't put a framework in place, or I didn't like give my employees direction in this area. Like it does come down to me almost every time, like almost every time. And even when you say it doesn't, I'm like, but I probably still could have done better somewhere here. So yeah, it's freeing in the sense that you can feel the forward progress as you keep applying it. You're like, okay, well, I'm not dealing with the same shit I was dealing a year ago, 2 years ago, because we're moving forward on that. Yeah.
So just a snapshot today, you said you're doing like around like 2.5 million in revenue. What's the size of the organization? And then I'm going to backtrack us with a couple questions as well. But just what is the current snapshot of number of people in the organization and how it kind of fits together for?
Yeah. So let's say this, we're on track, like our budget going into we're tracking. So we typically book a year to sometimes even 18 months out for expeditions. So money collected in is different than money produced, but for what we're tracking for the next year is 3.4 right now, I think. And then organizationally, we have a pretty lean internal team. We've got full-time employees. We've got myself, Jordan, the other co-founder, Fish, who's our field operations director, and Joey, who's our assessment specialist. So basically taking in all those assessments. And then we have a lot of subcontractors. We've got a fractional CFO who's doing a lot of finances. Then we've got a guy who's part-time doing all of our back-end software automations and stuff like that. And then we have our boot camp team in Africa. So we have PD and 2 moto instructors out there who are running things. It's a good question, man. I actually don't even know what the size of my team is. I think that, I don't know if I added it all up. Yeah. And then we have like contractor graphic designers and stuff like that too, who are like our dedicated graphic designers, but they're on a contractor payroll. So depends on how you want to apply it.
Yeah.
But
I was curious. But the question that I was kind of bridging, and you kind of touched on it before, how did you manage being a dad, working a full-time job?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what were some of the structures or things that you implemented that made that all feasible and workable? Like what did a normal day look like in terms of how you kept care of yourself, your health, your family, the business stuff? Because I think a lot of guys are trying to figure that out.
Yeah, dude. I mean, I don't know that I'm the guy to go to, because I didn't like I
What do
didn't
you mean by that?
I didn't have balance in the sense that, like, when you're saying, okay, like, what was the structure you had for yourself? A couple of things. One, I married an incredible woman. And so she was very patient and understanding with me saying, hey, like, babe, this is my vision. This is what I'm building. And what that means is it's going to be taking time away from time we would spend together in the evenings for a while, for like a couple of years. And then we had, like I said, young kid, and then kids eventually, all in that kind of period. And no, there wasn't really any like sense of balance, because if you want to know what an average day looked like, dude, like it was exhausting. Like I didn't like
Just
I'd work for
take us through a
BPA.
day.
Yeah, so typical day, I would wake up at 4:30 a.m., 5 a.m., usually 4:30 a.m. I'd wake up. I couldn't leave the house because my wife worked shift work at the hospital. And so most of the mornings, my wife wasn't there to take the kids. So I would have my daughter, who was at the time, let's say when I first started that, I mean, she was 1 when we first started. She's 4 now. But I'd get my daughter up because she was already an early riser. My daughter would be up by like 5, always. She still is. And I'd get her all bundled up into her coat and parka and all that stuff. And then we go out in my garage, where the temperature was in the winter here in Calgary. It sits around 0 in my garage. Then I do a workout for an hour while my daughter sat there in her parka and like watched me work out. Then I would get her, usually I bring a little snack or something in the garage, but then we'd come in, have breakfast, get her ready for her daycare, get her bundled up, take her off to daycare. So she's like at daycare by usually around anywhere between 7 and 8, but usually, yeah, somewhere there, 7, 8 o'clock. But by the time 8 o'clock rolled up, 8 o'clock is when I started work for BTA. So I'd start work at 8 o'clock, work with BTA, like I said, doing all the marketing stuff, building up the team and directing content and stuff there. And then I'd wrap at 5 or just before 5, because then the daycare closed at 5 o'clock. So I was like running out the door. Usually I'm like in a meeting or often directing a meeting. I'm like, I gotta get out of here because I gotta pick up my daughter. So I'm always trying to end like 10 minutes early, pick her up at 5. And then if my wife was home, she'd usually, like if she worked an early shift, she'd be home. She would have made dinner. If she wasn't home, didn't make dinner, then I'm running out there, grabbing the kids, trying to like throw something together for dinner. Definitely not like, I was not the picture of providing healthy food as a dad, because it was whatever I could find and throw together. Do dinner, do cleanup. Usually my wife, depending on what shift she was working, was home at that time. And then you do the bedtime routine with the kid and kids. And it basically, even as I had multiple kids, it kind of stayed the same. So do the bedtime routine, bath, get them ready for bed, bedtime stories, get them tucked in. Then I'd come back, clean up dinner. So kids are in bed usually by 6:37, clean up everything from dinner, 8 o'clock. And then the thing that held me the most accountable, I've had other entrepreneurs ask me this before. They're like, well, how do you have the discipline to like sit down and get shit done, especially when you're exhausted? The best thing you can do is schedule appointments or meetings with people, because then you are not going to back out of them. And so for me, it was scheduling sales calls from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night. I would schedule sales calls, and then I would get on with guys that were interested in Freshline. One of the benefits to building a business like off the side of your desk is the fact that the only time you have is typically in the evening. And if you're building a business, you have to sell something. It's actually a benefit often to be selling in the evenings, because you're like, hey, I'm going to catch these guys when no one else is like trying to get them, or they're not at work doing their thing or whatever. So it was a benefit to sell in the evening. And so then I'd sell until 11 o'clock, then get ready for bed. Not unusual at all, where I'd be like, okay, I'm catching up on finishing off sales notes and stuff until midnight. And they do it all again the next day. Like, dude, I went literal years where I would slept for like 4 or 5 hours a night. I'm not saying that's healthy, but yeah, I took the weekends off from sales, but even then kids were up super, super early. So I would just try to get to bed earlier, but yeah, there was a lot of exhausted period in there. So if you're saying, oh, what was the balance you found when I was doing both? It wasn't there.
Yeah, and it's great. I love that you brought up balance. I've had a lot of conversations about balance. I think we need to redefine it. Balance is not equitable. It's not equal one and the other. For me, the way I define it now is balance is when you're spending your time in alignment with what's important to you. Like, it sounds like you were very purposeful with you're spending your time this way, and that was in alignment with what you wanted. It was hard, but it wasn't like it was out of an expectation, like out of alignment. Like there was a vision, there was purpose, there was sacrifice, and it wasn't equal, but you were in alignment with what you wanted or what you were trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say if anything, there were times when I felt out of alignment, but it wasn't with Freshline ever. It was with the fact that I was working with BTA, and I was like, man, like it felt like I could just get so much more accomplished if I didn't have the day job. I was like, oh, like, but at the time, it was exactly what needed to be done in order to make sure that there was enough money coming in to pay the bills. So,
what would you do differently if you were to do it again, or would you do anything differently?
I wouldn't do anything differently at all. I mean, the only thing you could say is if I could do it all again, it's easier to do before you have a family, before you have kids, but you don't know that before you have kids. Like, I mean, I was an entrepreneur for a decade before I had kids. You don't know how much of an advantage you have until you lose it, until you're like, oh, like, yeah, having kids, having a family, having those responsibilities and wanting to show up as a good dad and being there and being focused with them, like that's going to draw a bunch of time too. And so, yeah, I mean, the only thing, quote unquote, if I could do it differently would be, well, maybe I'd put that much emphasis into Freshline years earlier. But at the same time, having a family, in my instance, brings you another level of accountability that you didn't have before, that gives you a bit more of a kick up the butt to be disciplined, to like, I'm going to see this thing through. So
that was going to be my follow-up question, which is like, there's advantages to doing things before you have kids. What have been the advantages to your business now that you have a family?
If I'm hearing the question correctly, I might answer it slightly differently, but one thing that I think is to a huge advantage to the business today is the amount of bouncing around I did do in my 20s. Because I ran a number of different businesses in my 20s. I was trying to figure out, like, what do I really want to do? And there's a number of different people that talk about this, but something that has been talked about by Alex Hormozi is this concept of skill stacking. And the general concept is like, listen, if you can do math, that's useful. But if you can do math and figure out how to do that as it applies to money, that's even more useful, because now you can actually like be a CPA, or at least look at the financials of the company and know what you're talking about. And if you can stack math with how it applies to money, and then stack that with how do people think and what motivates them, now all of a sudden you can not be just a CPA, but you can actually be a financial manager in a business, and like you start skill stacking. And so for me, I figured out that the thing that I was both interested in and good at was marketing. And so it took me a little while to like figure out what that looked like. And even when I figured out like, oh, I enjoy this thing and I'm okay at it, there's many, many years of refining the things you know in the real world. Like, okay, that's great. This is a concept. How does that apply to the real world? How do I understand it? How do I apply it? So I would say I actually worked very hard in my 20s on a number of different businesses. And a lot of those lessons, almost all of them, I would say, apply to the business that I've got today, including very, very much so BTA. Like, I wouldn't do anything differently. BTA gave me an immeasurable amount of insight into the management side of a business. I had an okay track record of like figuring out how to market and sell. I had a very poor track record of knowing how to like manage money after that, and build something in a business that was repeatable, sustainable from an operational standpoint. And so BTA taught me so much about the management side of the business. So I wouldn't have changed anything. I didn't even know it at the time. I had a sense like, okay, this would be good for me to see how this all works and how it's implemented. But both seeing the systems and how they were implemented, and watching the patterns of 600 business owners in the trades, and like watching these guys and watching their attitude towards the responsibilities of their businesses and how that played out over a series of years, gave me a really strong insight so that when my team says, hey, I think we should do this, or what do you think about this? I'm like, oh, I've seen this pattern play out. Sometimes in my own experience, and a lot of times in the patterns that I saw while BTA is consulting with all these businesses. So, yeah, I don't think I would change anything. And I drifted off from your original question, which was like, okay, how has the responsibilities of family
Positively impacted the business?
Positively impacted the business? The word that comes to mind for me is just responsibility. It's just like, hey, like I'm more disciplined and I'm more responsible when it comes to taking on everything, because there's more gravity to me failing. I think when I was in my 20s before I had family, I was like, it doesn't matter because I have nothing to lose, because I didn't really. I was like, who cares? Like, who cares if I'm homeless? Like, it doesn't matter. I didn't even own much. Like, I didn't own anything. I rented places. Like, most of the time, everything I owned could fit into a backpack, and I wanted it that way. I wanted that freedom, because as you can tell from my business currently, like I was a bit nomadic, and I like that. But having family, let me rephrase that. Being a dad, if you take it seriously, it should mature you. It should mature you to say, like, there are things that are more important, far more important, that you're totally missing when you don't have that concept as a dad, that you need to take into consideration within the business, within more so like looking at your own employees and saying, okay, like, how do I value my employees, and what their dreams and goals and visions are. Your own dreams and goals and visions will potentially shift because you just realize the things that you wanted before and your focus that you had before is different. And I would say in my case, like, the purpose of the business shifted as well. Not everybody can be so lucky to run an organization that's very focused on men's mental health and having guys accountable to each other. But when I actually had a family, I was like, oh, I see how easy it is to actually screw this up on a daily basis. It added to the weight of what we were actually doing. And so I'd say those are the ways that it like being a dad impacted the business side of things, was just like taking everything more seriously, which meant that I had more staying power when things got, when I should say currently, when things get challenging. I'm like, no, there's more staying power to being like, no, this is important. This is important work we're doing, and we're going to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was picking up on. And I also feel like there's like a different layer of filters that get added through every decision too. You can't just be as quick to switch it. Like, it adds a little bit more of a pause. I think you mentioned ADHD. I think I've talked to so many guys over the last couple of years. So many business owner dads have it, or are like self-diagnosed with it.
Yeah,
it's pretty surprising. I wanted to switch gears. We'll probably wrap things up in a second here, but really curious about what the future looks like. So first question around that is, what are you excited about for the next couple of years as Freshline continues to grow? But more on the meaningful side too, is like, what is the legacy that you're hoping this organization leaves for guys, but also for your kids, like what you're doing?
You might have to remind me of the second question by the time I wrap up the first one.
Yeah.
But like, as far as future of Freshline, like, what am I looking forward to? You know what, man? I think I actually keep it pretty brief. Like, we have a very kind of robust business plan. Like, okay, this is how the business can grow pretty significantly. But the reason that we've built a plan that includes a certain level of scale has nothing to do really with the finances of the business and like, okay, we have to do this for financial reasons. The biggest factor is, oh, I can see the positive impact we're having on guys. How do we just reach more guys? Like, how do we have that positive impact on more individuals because they've heard of us as opposed to they haven't? So when it comes to like, what am I looking forward to? This business has grown rapidly in the last few years. So now we've got hundreds of members that are part of Freshline. And because it's grown so rapidly, a lot of these guys are relatively new. And I would say only just now am I starting to feel like a lot of these guys that came on 2 years ago, a year ago, I'm like, okay, now these are actually feeling like genuine relationships because we're building time. So there's a quote out there that says, there's a time when it's too late to make old friends. And so for me, I'm like, oh, we're building that up, because I would love to get to, be an old man and be able to have guys that I've known for decades and swap adventure stories from when we were young and doing this stuff, and now we're too old to do it anymore. I'm like, yeah, these are all the things that we used to do, and then we have, you know, the stupid shit we did or the things that we laugh about or whatever. But you have to build those relationships now. So what I'm enjoying right now, and I think what I am most looking forward to, and the whole reason we built the club, is those genuine relationships where guys are reaching out to you just to check in, or I'm reaching out vice versa, and you're jumping on these calls every 2 weeks and you're like genuinely interested in what's going on in their lives. And we're very connected when it comes to like what's going on with our families and our kids and all of that stuff. And so to me, it's just deepening those relationships, just saying, hey, just more time in general with those guys. And sure, we'll run a few expeditions in between and we'll meet, you know, in different places around the world for a member muster or just a ride here or there. Like, yes, but yeah, it's just deepening those relationships. So that's the thing I'm looking most forward to, not the, here's the 7-step plan we've got to scale the business. Now you have to remind me of your second question. What was your second question?
It was just around like legacy. Like,
yeah.
What does this mean, bigger picture as an organization, but also like the legacy for your kids by doing something like this?
My dream with Freshline and my impact on Freshline is that I'm totally forgotten. Like, I want that to happen. I don't want this to be about Erik or Jordan as a co-founder. I've told the guys many times, guys, I'm a steward of this. I'm a steward of the brotherhood for now. Like, I don't want you to look at me as the owner or the guy that's like, okay, whatever Erik says, this is the way it goes. I'm like, no, what I'm trying to do is just give men a framework that gives them some principles to live by, myself very much included. I mean, these are principles I needed first and foremost. I don't want guys to know who I am in the organization. I don't want it to be about me at all. Like, if I look at our member portal and I see guys that are meeting up in Europe, or I see guys that are meeting up in whatever, Arkansas, or I see guys that are meeting up in South Africa or whatever it is, and they're getting together and they are enjoying each other's company and they're supporting each other through a certain set of principles, through our 4 values, I'm like, hey, if I can do that and that concept continues to grow, mission accomplished. Like, I don't want to be part of that. And so when it comes to my kids and the legacy I'm leaving for them, irrelevant, honestly. When it comes to Freshline, when it comes to the business side, because it'd be better if my kids knew that there was nothing coming to them from the business. That was the way my dad raised me. Like, we grew up in a little wilderness resort in BC, British Columbia, for anybody that's listening from the outside world. But my dad said from as early as I remember, like, hey, if you want this, you have to buy it in full from me. You're not getting any special favors because you're my son. And in my early days, I did think that was something I wanted, but that was a driver for me. And not having that just handed to me, it forced me to say, if I want to buy this thing, which was worth a decent amount of money, how would I make enough money to buy this business, this like massive acreage and a bunch of cabins and a lake in the mountains in the Okanagan in BC, where prices are not super low. So that drove a lot of my early kind of initiation into the business world and like, how do I figure these things out? And then finally, there was a point where I had the opportunity to actually buy out that business. And I had a really hard moment where I was like, wait a minute, did I do this because I really wanted it? Or did I do it because I think that's what my dad wanted and was like pushing me into all along? And I realized it was probably more so the latter. And my dad, to his absolute credit, was like, when we were sitting there and talking about the business and taking it over, and I had a really hard like father-son moment where you don't want to disappoint your father as a son. And I was like, hey, I don't think I want to do this. And I literally broke down crying. And he's like, hey, like, I need you to go get a Post-it note, and I want you to write on there, like, I love you no matter what you do, no matter what decision you make. Like, you don't need to feel bad if you don't want to take this business or business over as part of the family business. And that was really important for me, because that moment actually freed me to say, okay, what is it I actually want to do? And that's really what allowed me to look at the whole Freshline concept. So, dude, I'm giving you super long-winded answers, but my legacy, the only legacy I would say I have, and we actually, ironically, this was the discussion topic for a breakout room in the last huddle we had just 2 days ago here, which is like, what do you think is your purpose in life? And for me right now, my only purpose is to be the best dad and father and husband as I can be, because if I can figure that out, there will be fallout, positive effects for the guys through the things that I learn in trying and striving to do that. But I sat down and really thought about this, and I was like, if I lose the business, I'll be okay. If I lose connection with my family, I will not be okay. So I came to the realization, the only thing that actually matters in life is the connection I've got with my wife and my kids. It's the only thing that matters at all. And so I'm like, hey, I will do the best I can in that regard. And that's it. Like that's my legacy. And to me, it's all conceptual. Like if my grandkids don't know my name, or my great grandkids don't know my name, that's okay, because to me, it's not about that. It's about the principles and the way that I showed up to my kids, and just hoping that they can show up in the same way for theirs. So yeah, long-winded answers, Fife. I know you're yeah, but that's
I seem to be good at eliciting those from people.
Yeah.
Erik, thanks so much. I had a ton of fun. I want to close this out after we stop recording, but where can people find you? If somebody's interested to find out more about what you guys are up to, how do they find out?
They can check out, our website is freshlineclub.com, or most people I would encourage to just check out our Instagram. So Freshline Moto Club on Instagram, Freshline Moto Club. Go check it out on Instagram, because we're constantly posting just like these expeditions that we're going on, what that looks like, and then some snapshots from the events and stuff that we run as members together. But yeah, that's where you get a good idea of what we're doing in the world.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, wife. I appreciate it, man.